Now, another way that the author mentions oppressors maintain control over people is that they control their dominance by positioning the oppressed against each other and making it so the oppressed are attracted to the oppressor's way of life. So think of various assimilation tactics that are used today. So people immigrate into this country, and their ways of being and their values are not valued by the dominant culture, and they are asked to assimilate into that. That is a form of control from a cultural standpoint. Okay, so what does that example look like in the classroom? So one example that comes to mind is the ways that kids are supposed to behave in class. So how loud their voices are, or soft their voices are, how they are supposed to sit, whether they are supposed to get up frequently or just maintain sitting in a seat for an extended period of time, whether they're supposed to ask questions or not ask questions, whether they're supposed to question authority in particular, whether they can pose alternatives to assignments, whether they can set their own assignment dates. These are all simple examples of ways that educators can unintentionally act as oppressors in a classroom setting. And the way that it's done is by asserting certain ways of learning and certain ways of being within, quote, learning environments as being more acceptable or less acceptable than others. This is a form of control and a form of dominance. And if you listen to many of the interviews in this podcast, you'll hear that many of the guests have talked about how they try and avoid that. They try and make it so that students have a voice and that it's interest-driven and that kids are able to set their own expectations and ways of being in a classroom setting, etc. These are all ways that align with the author's approach of pedagogy of the oppressed. Whether it's stated or not, they're at least related to it. Okay, so one more tactic of control is that oppressors often end up controlling the narrative about the oppressed and eventually getting them to believe their own negative image. So for an example, one of the studies that I have read is a discourse analysis on the use of the word urban in professional journals. Now, what was found is that the way that urban was used was very different in terms of the kinds of descriptions used for other words like suburban or rural schools. In fact, the discourse around urban schooling often used negative terminology, saying that students were lacking, or just a general deficit model, and that students were incapable of assimilating to the proper, quote, ways of schooling and learning. So again, the oppressors, in this case, people who are writing journal articles, were controlling the narrative on describing urban kids and urban learning and learning in urban context as being deficient or lacking, and that can carry over into the kids who go to those schools as feeling like they are deficient or lacking, even if they're not. Especially if we ask the question, deficient and lacking in what, and according to whom? This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 50, which is titled Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Chapter 1. You can listen to the full episode as well as hundreds more by searching for the CSK8 podcast on your favorite podcast app or by going to jaredoleary.com.